Ours is an era of dollar domination.
If there can be said to be a world currency, the US dollar is undoubtedly it.
The vast majority of international trade is done in dollars, and it's the currency of choice for central banks hoping to save up for tough times.
So in this video, we'll explain the dollar's rise to power.
People use the dollar because they've always used the dollar.
We'll find out what keeps it at the top of the money tree.
Where would you rather be invested right now when you look at the world as a whole? For many people, the answer is the US.
And reveal whether the dollar's supremacy can ever be challenged. If so, by what?
Some changes are coming even for a dominant currency such as the dollar. It could become a less important payment currency in international transactions.
Are the dollar's days as the king of currencies numbered? Or has it attained an unassailable edge?
Find out in this edition of Business Beyond. 1944. A war that's brought misery to millions is entering its endgame. Meanwhile, the dollar is being set on course for world domination. Meeting at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, representatives of 44 countries agreed to a new world monetary order, with the US currency at the center of it.
Certainly the US emerged from World War II as the world's dominant and leading economy. And the Bretton Woods system that was created after World War II had embedded within it as a particular role for the dollar. I mean, the dollar had a link to gold, but other currencies were all linked to the dollar. So the post-war monetary system embedded within it the centrality of the dollar.
In the 1970s, US President Richard Nixon ditched the dollar's convertibility to gold. But by then it had already been firmly installed as the central currency for global trade.
And because of the United States' size, the dollar in a sense was a natural currency for most international transactions. And there's the added advantage that because the dollar was the central currency of the system, if two countries wanted to trade with each other, the easiest currency to use was generally the dollar.
And so it continues to be. If entities in two different countries with two different currencies want to trade with one another, they'll almost certainly do so in dollars. The US currency is involved in 88% of international transactions.
What's more, the dollar is the currency of choice for trading in all manner of globally important commodities like oil, coffee, and gold. But as well as sitting at the center of global trade, the dollar dominates in another key field.
And the dollar is the world's most important reserve currency. That is, it is the currency in which foreign central banks hold their rainy day funds, so to speak.
When it comes to having money set aside for hard times, to fund exports, service debt, or balance their own currency, central banks and treasuries more often than not put their faith in the dollar. According to the International Monetary Fund, of all of the foreign exchange reserves held by countries around the world, over 60% of them are in dollars. No other currency comes close.
The reality is that there aren't any serious rivals to the dollar as a reserve currency. When a country wants to make its currency a reserve currency, it needs to issue a lot of what are considered safe assets by the rest of the world. And much of the rest of the world, foreign investors, both private and official, seem to view US government securities as a very good place to park their money during times of economic turmoil.
What does the dollar environment provide for investors? Deep and liquid capital, private capital markets, a legal system that protects property rights, and free flow of capital. The US has also been more willing than other countries to be the lender of last resort. So I think all these factors create this environment whereby, and I think this is important to underline as well, we're not saying these factors are perfect, but on a relative basis, they seem to be more favorable for the US dollar to be a global reserve currency.
We'll talk about whether any other currency can ever rival the dollar in the world's reserves shortly. But first, let's look at what the existent dollar supremacy means for the United States.
There's a term that often gets used when discussing this very subject, originally coined in the 60s by French finance minister and later president Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. He described dollar dominance as America's exorbitant privilege.
He was making a specific point about the use of dollars by central banks in Europe, but that core idea that the US benefits greatly from its currency's power is still often cited.
The privilege is generally thought to be that the US, and particularly the US government, can borrow internationally at a slightly lower rate than would otherwise be the case. The US can finance current account, mostly trade deficits more readily and more easily and with fewer risk than other economies. And that certainly, there's an element of truth to that, although all the major advanced economies finance themselves in their own currency without any real difficulty, and often can finance themselves at lower rates than the US does.
So the constant global demand brings advantages to the United States itself. However, what some describe as America's privilege can also sometimes be its burden.
One of the criticisms is there is a lot of demand for the US dollar. What does this do to the currency? It leads it to appreciate and to be stronger than other currencies. And the repercussions for the US economy is that it makes US exports less competitive. A stronger currency will make US manufacturing, for instance, less competitive. And some associate the long-term decline in US manufacturing sector in part to the role of the US dollar as a reserve currency.
It also creates a burden on the Fed, because the Fed has to, in certain cases, act as the dollar lender of last resort to the world. And it did take up on that role in the global financial crisis and during the COVID shock through the swap lines. That's in some sense a burden, but it's also in some sense a necessity, because the offshore dollar market is actually an important market for funding U.S. companies. And so instability in the offshore dollar market would clearly reverberate back.
That's what it means for the US, but what are the costs and benefits of global dollar supremacy for the rest of the world? Is the lack of competition at the monetary top table a positive or a negative?
Certainly, there's sort of a network efficiency that comes from having a dominant currency, so that, two countries in Africa that want to trade with each other know that they can settle that trade in dollars. And if they have dollars, they can conduct that trade, and they don't have to worry about negotiating a settlement currency for every transaction.
So everybody using the dollar is basically convenient. Everyone knows where they stand, and there's no messy bartering over which of two parties has the most desirable currency to hold. But the involvement of dollars in so much of world trade leaves economies far away from the United States subject to the effects of decisions taken there.
U.S. monetary policy, which is directed at domestic U.S. conditions, ends up having an outsized impact on global financial conditions. And that can at times contribute to financial economic difficulties around the world. Everybody in the past year has faced pressure on their currency, in part because the U.S. is a big economy, and any shift in U.S. monetary policy would have an impact globally, but also in part because the dollar is used around the world, and dollar interest rates have gone up around the world. And so the impact of dollar strength and Fed tightening gets magnified.
So that's the double-edged sword of dollar dominance. But could it actually be any other way?
Let's get down to that question of whether the US currency's supremacy could ever be challenged. And if so, by what?
So let's go back to the fundamentals. Why is the dollar the preferred or dominant global reserve currency? Deep liquid capital markets, protection of property rights, capital flows that are free. How are they likely to change in 5 to 10 years? And where will these factors be more favorable than in the US? Can we look at another country that is as willing as the US to be the lender of last resort? When you look at the global foreign reserves, dollar is dominant. Next is the euro?
So when the euro was created in 1999, it was believed that the euro area could end up with its currency becoming a serious competitor with the dollar as a reserve currency, as a payment currency, and so on. And it is true that the euro area economies all put together had a size that was roughly equivalent to that of the US, although that has shifted a bit over time. Now, Eurozone financial markets are quite large, but certainly not as large as those in the US.
We saw earlier that the euro is number 2 when it comes to the world's foreign currency reserves, albeit by some distance. So what would have to happen for the gap to close?
Well, one key thing holding the euro back comes down to the very essence of the Eurozone. It's a monetary union made up of countries using the same currency, but with very different economies.
As we went through the Eurozone debt crisis and other problems in Europe, it appears that foreign investors don't quite view, for instance, a Greek government bond the same way they would a German Bund, which is seen as a lot safer and more liquid. So if you take the size of Eurozone financial markets concentrated in the core part of the Eurozone, it looks much smaller than the US.
Can the European Union move to a credible fiscal union in the next 5 to 10 years? I think that could chip away a little bit from the US dollar's role.
The dollar's strength just recently has been partly down to the US economy's resilience to current world events. That's something that sets it apart from the Eurozone.
War on the EU's doorstep and the economic hardship it's wrought on many European citizens has laid bare how vulnerable the Eurozone is to geopolitics.
Europe has been, dealing with centrifugal forces that threaten to pull the zone apart. So there is a fair degree of political instability within the Eurozone, and that, of course, waxes and wanes. But if you think about foreign investors trying to find a place to put their money for the long term, there might be some concerns about Europe. So the reality is that the fragmentation that we've seen in Europe, despite the currency union, I think has kept the euro from becoming a reserve currency that could compete toe-to-toe with the US dollar.
So it seems we're not about to enter the euro era just yet. But if not the euro, can any other fiat currency ever rise to compete with the dollar?
Could the world's second biggest economy, behind the US, provide the breeding ground for another truly global currency?
So the Chinese renminbi or yuan is an interesting currency because it was only about a decade ago that the Chinese government seemed willing to allow the renminbi to be more widely used around the world and seemed to be desirous of making the renminbi an international currency.
And Beijing scored a big win in its efforts to establish the renminbi as a major reserve currency back in 2016. The yuan joined the ranks of the dollar, the Japanese yen, the British pound, and the euro when the International Monetary Fund added it to the basket of currencies that make up its special drawing rights, or SDR. That's the IMF's own reserve asset that countries can use to top up their foreign reserves.
Since then, the Chinese currency has lost momentum.
The renminbi has essentially flatlined. And that's because the Chinese economy, first of all, was not doing so well, and foreign investors were a little leery of putting their money in China's financial markets. But more importantly, I think foreign investors don't have as much trust in the renminbi because China does not boast of many of these institutional framework elements that virtually every other reserve currency economy enjoys, such as the rule of law, where even the government has to play by the rules of game once they are determined.
And then China has the additional limitation that China cannot put its international reserves in itself. And so until there's an offshore yuan market of enormous size, China's reserves their choices are more limited.
It's possible to imagine a world where more countries would want to hold their reserves in yuan.
The US and EU were able to hit Russia in the pocket after its invasion of Ukraine by freezing Moscow's access to its dollar and euro reserves.
The current system means the West has an overwhelming stranglehold on the world's money stores.
No doubt, some smaller countries could consider whether or not they wanted to take the risk associated with putting more of their reserves in the yuan, whether as an alternative to the dollar or as a hedge against the risk that your relationship with the United States might deteriorate.
But would that be enough to enable the Chinese currency to compete with the dollar?
I don't think the renminbi has the potential to become a serious rival to the dollar, especially as a reserve currency. Although as China becomes more important in the global economy, the global trading system, and if China plays its cards right with certain reforms to maintain the free flow of capital across its borders, I could see the renminbi becoming a more important payment currency, but still not one that really seriously threatens the dollar.
Okay, so that's basically the euro and the yuan out. But what about other national currencies? How about the British pound or the Japanese yen?
Well, despite having a couple of centuries of global domination itself, the UK currency is showing no signs of returning to past glories. And the share of global reserves denominated in yen has actually declined in recent years.
Though the US dollar's share has been falling a little, it hasn't been because of the behaviour of other major currencies.
But this entire decline in the dollar share has been taken up by the smaller reserve currencies such as the Canadian dollar, the Australian dollar, and the smattering of other currencies. So at most, I see some of the shares of these second and third tier currencies rising marginally, the dollar share perhaps dropping a little bit, but the gulf between the dollar and all the other currencies is, if anything, widening right now.
But could stiff competition come from a total newcomer? 2023 kicked off with Brazil and Argentina saying they were beginning work on a shared currency, with the aim of eventually allowing other South American countries to join. It would be the world's second largest currency union after the euro, but probably therefore even less likely to challenge dollar dominance.
So if traditional fiat currencies are showing no sign of unseating the dollar, could competition come from elsewhere and outside of the control of central banks?
Cryptocurrencies provide speculators with a place to park their money and a means by which to buy products across borders. So could they ever perform the same functions for economies around the world?
We certainly seem to be entering a new era of competition in money with privately issued currencies, such as cryptocurrencies, potentially taking on some of the functions of money. But the reality we've seen is that decentralized cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin, which are basically issued and managed by computer algorithm rather than by any institutional agency, they seem to have very volatile value and are not working very well as mediums of exchange.
A look at Bitcoin's performance over just the past 2 years shows you that that's all too true. Its value against the dollar has fluctuated wildly.
There are so-called stable coins that aim to provide a less risky investment, but they do so by pegging themselves to other assets, like, for example, fiat currencies.
I think compared to most cryptocurrencies, the dollar actually has a ton of advantages. Well regulated, certainly by comparison to crypto markets, financial institutions that can act as intermediaries, a deep and liquid market for interest-bearing securities, a counterparty, if you buy US treasuries, that is the most credible counterparty in the global financial system. So I actually have a little bit of difficulty believing that cryptocurrencies are a realistic alternative, to be honest.
We'll probably spend many years debating the relevance of cryptocurrencies as a reserve currency for the world. Let's see what happens in the next 5 to 10 years. Are central banks going to move towards digital currencies that are less speculative in nature and more stable in value? Then the answer could change.
So no obvious signs of cryptos challenging the dollar either. But just because no challenger among the digital or traditional currencies seems likely to emerge, that doesn't mean we won't see the dollar's power diminish.
New technologies plus financial development in emerging markets, it's making it easier to trade pairs of emerging market currencies without an intermediating currency such as the dollar. So the dollar's role as a vehicle currency in international payments, I think, is likely to decline.
But what's our overall verdict? Are the days of dollar dominance showing any signs of ending?
I think we could live in a world where it doesn't remain such a dominant global currency and reserve currency, but I do not see these factors as playing out to unseat it completely.
I think it is hard to see the dollar ever just becoming another small currency that's not a big part of the global system.
Some changes are coming even for a dominant currency such as the dollar. As a reserve currency, however, my view is that the dollar is likely to retain its dominance for a long time to come.
That's all from this edition of Business Beyond, but if you've made it this far, we reckon you'd enjoy this video too. We'll see you over there.